All right, welcome to the Montana Organic Association venue for students to present their work. I'm really impressed with the quality and ingenuity of the students. And, this is the future of where research is headed. So thank you very much for sharing your work.
So I'm Tim Seipel, and thanks for attending today and going through the student presentations. We wanted to put this together because there's a number of students out there who are doing research on organic cropping systems, managing weeds, all those aspects, precision agriculture and in organics. And we thought we'd get together and present some of our work. And so I think there's 5 presentations that we have all together now that are available to watch on the MOA page. And today we thought we would just go through, let each of the students give a 5-minute synopsis of what they found and what they're working on, and then we can address some questions at the end. So I think I'll pass it over to Kara Hedinger. So she's a new graduate student in the weed ecology group, and she's working on part of the Creep Stop project. And so she was really the machine behind the session and got it worked out with Jamie and got student presentation. So I thought I'd let her do a little bit of the start it out, and then we can pass it around to each one of the students and ask some of their questions. If anyone else has anything to contribute, I think it's a small enough group that we can all chime in or add it into the chat on the side. So with that, Kara, I'll let you introduce yourself and your project.
Awesome. Well, yeah, hi everyone. And I would just like to also say thanks for being here, and also thank you to the students who submitted things and let me heckle you for the last month and a half. I really appreciate it and found everyone's very interesting. So that was awesome to see. But yeah, I guess I'll start us out. If anyone didn't have a chance to see my presentation, it involved integrated weed management as a control for creeping perennials in organic agroecosystems. And our study is a 4-year-long study, which also includes biological and mechanical controls in integrated weed management. I particularly for this conference focused on the preliminary results in regards to diverse cropping rotations as a method of long-term suppression for thistle. So just a quick recap, there were 8 total rotational sequences that were applied across 8 different sites in the state of Montana. 6 of these sites were smaller collaborator farms, which received 3 of the 8 treatments. And we also had 2 additional research farms, one here in Bozeman and another one, which was the Central Ag Research Center near Moccasin. And those 2 farms received all 8 rotational sequences. So looking at these results, for this presentation, we focused specifically on the Central Ag Research Center, so one of our larger farms, and 3 of our collaborator farms to look at results. And like I said, this is data from 2019 and 2020, so the first 2 years of rotations. So looking at the results from our research farm up in Moccasin, we saw, in fact, unfortunately, an increase in thistle biomass across all rotations. So no real trends of one being showing a decrease or just one showing an increase in thistle. We saw a fairly steady increase across all 8 rotations. However, as I mentioned in my video, I think there are some pretty good explanations as to why that might be so. First and foremost, there was a presence of a pest species, the painted lady caterpillar, in 2019 that was not present in the 2020 growing season. So that could have certainly decreased the biomass that was gathered in 2019. Additionally, the plots at Clark were selected because they had existing patches of Canada thistle. And certainly we saw a spread from these patches into new plots and certainly expanding their range in existing plots from 2019 to 2020. And we believe that these two factors combined certainly could lead to the increase we saw across all 8 rotations. However, at the 3 collaborator sites, we saw a bit more interesting results. First, at the Heinbaugh farm, we saw a decrease in thistle biomass across all rotations. So the opposite of what we saw at our larger research site. And one interesting confounding factor we think went into play there was the fact that the thistle was mowed in 2020 and it was not mowed in 2019. And we think that that could have had an effect on the thistle showing the decrease. At our final 2 collaborator sites, the Bailey and Deacon farms, we saw a slight increase in thistle biomass in rotation 4, but overall a relative maintenance of thistle patches from 2019 to 2020. And this is sort of all to say that certainly, again, this is preliminary data from the first 2 years of a 4-year study. And there's a lot of seasonal variations that come into play, certainly. However, it did give us some interesting things to look into, such as mowing as a potential management strategy for controlling Canada thistle. As well, we hope to look at the climate variance between these sites going forward to see if that impacts success of certain rotations or certain management options. And finally, we do know that integrated weed management is a very successful way to handle creeping perennials in organic agroecosystems. And this is just one aspect of a multifaceted study. So going forward, we certainly look to combine the effects of diverse cropping rotations with biological control like thistle rust or other mechanical controls. So thank you.
Do we want to ask any questions right now of Kara, and then we can move on to the next presentation?
I have a question. So my question is, you said there's an increase in patches. Are those increases in existing patches, or are you talking about new patches as well?
Both. It looked from our data as if they certainly appeared to spread in the plots that they already existed. So an increase in biomass in those plots, and also a spread into plots that there was not any thistle in 2019. So going from 0 to, 3 plants or something like that.
So in your management aspects of things, is there a way of focusing on those 3 plants? Because there's a hell lot easier to take out than a whole big spot, so to speak.
Right. I guess not specifically across the whole study. I think it is certainly interesting to look at ones that are spreading by its root system. So seeing patches increase where thistle is already present versus thistle, growing by seed. But I imagine in our study using our various control methods, we do try, to look at how thistle can be controlled either in small or large patches, no matter how it spreads. So sort of looking at it in a bigger picture, as opposed to looking at small patches and how we would attack those compared to large. But that is also something that, we might study a little bit more in the future. That answers.
This is Jeff Chizinski. I need a bigger picture, and I should go look at the more details. But from the bigger picture, the premise of this is that with some design of rotation, that over time the rotation itself controls the weeds. Do I got that basically correct?
Correct. Yeah, and certainly too. As I mentioned, this is just one aspect. So we also have different type of reduced and standard till treatments going on, in addition to biological controls. So it is a little bit difficult to parse by itself, because again, too, we could eventually see our tillage, being one of our main factors, and then that combined with the different rotations can show us results. So, yeah.
And so is there, in the literature of this research, background, is there precedence? Is there other studies that have shown, it takes a long time to do these things, I imagine, but that has demonstrated that there is an effect of weed control via rotation in organic systems?
Yeah, and
This is something, go ahead, sorry.
oh no, you're good. Yeah, so one of our rotations, for example, is a 3-year alfalfa sequence, and often competition from alfalfa has been shown to reduce Canada thistle biomass and density over time. So all of these rotations were purposely designed with other studies in mind, and also looking to see if some of those tried and true studies like a 3-year alfalfa rotation would be successful in a place like, the Golden Triangle in Montana. So
It's that kind of actually interesting. Yesterday I was on a different call with O-Grain, which is they're folks from the Midwest, and there was a lot of talk of a couple years of alfalfa rotation, but there they of course they can make that into a valuable crop,
right.
So they can put that into the rotation because they've got, well, in some cases, not in all cases, that was actually the criteria, was there was when there was a market available for good, particularly if you could get the organic price for the alfalfa, then it made a lot of sense, and it did seem to break weeds when you put that kind of crop in a rotation. So that was interesting. Just two different parts of the world, I know, and very different parts of the world with rainfall.
I had just a couple basic methodology questions, Kara. How did you measure the thistle, and when and how often?
So thistle was in the first year, a spring density count was done, as well as a termination density count. And then they were cut and bagged, dried, and then a week later weighed for biomass. Certainly COVID this year, I believe I wasn't yet at the school, but threw off a little bit of the collections. There was no spring density counts taken. However, we still had termination densities at the end of the season, and that is done when the crop is determined to be, harvestable. So we do both thistle and crop at the same time, count them, terminate them, let them dry for up to a week, and then we weigh that biomass.
Gotcha. And was thistle established in all of the places that you did this research, or did you have to establish it in some places?
We, I believe, had establishments, at least for the 4 sites that I talked about in this presentation, there was established thistle.
Okay.
Some was seeded at CARC at our large research farm. However, I don't think that took very well. So established, or plots were based around established patches, to my knowledge.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, some of the just to add a little, Carrie answered it absolutely correctly. They all had established plots. Some of them, the density was much greater than others, and I think they had long established patches. So older patches with really extensive rhizome. At least Fort Ellis was 4 to 5 years old. I think there's something to what Ole said in regarding it's much easier to manage smaller, younger patches than it is to try to manage larger, older patches that are more dense. I think it's harder to win that competition. So if there are no more questions, do we want to move on to? Oh, go ahead.
Tim, I have a question. This is Bruce. Kara, it seems that your response variable is pretty much biomass.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you've done any work, or you know of others that have done the work to relate that to reproductive potential, either vegetative or sexual reproduction.
Right. Certainly a lot of people in studies have done that, and we ourselves take counts of flower heads. We are in the process of analyzing that data, as well as getting seed counts And then we hope to do some greenhouse studies on the seeds we collect. That data has not been yet processed for this year. But yeah, that is something we also hope to do, at least in terms of spreading by seed. We have not yet done any like root biomass stuff, and certainly that is a way that the thistle spreads. So at least in terms of seeds, yes, we eventually will analyze that, as well as like flower heads and such.
I think there's a lot of those relationships between biomass above ground, below ground, maybe even reproductive potential were done by Bill Donald many years ago, maybe in the 1970s even. You might have to go back a ways to find that, but there was a very good. He spent a big chunk of his career. He's long since retired, but studying Canada thistle and did all kinds of population biology work on it. But often people miss it because it was so old or it was done so long ago, so they don't search back far enough. But William Donald, look up in Canada thistle, you'll find some interesting stuff.
Yeah.
If you haven't already.
Yeah, certainly.
Well, thanks, Bruce. There's also a paper out of New Zealand where they did a matrix transition model, and they dug up in all kinds of rhizomes and did some kind of wild things with them.
Huh. Who was that?
A guy named Graham Bordeaux at
Oh yeah, I know Graham. Yep.
Oh yeah.
I figured.
Yeah.
All right, good.
Does anyone want to go volunteer next of the students, or should I just pick the next person on the list? So next to Kara in my video window is Sasha. So let Sasha go next.
Great. Can I share a slide? Does that work?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay. Okay, can you all see my window now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so so my talk was on farm precision experimentation, which is a methodology that our lab uses. So within our lab, we do this with conventional farmers, and my lab mate Paul Hegedus has been doing that for a while with conventional farmers. And so we were basically, the gist of this project is expanding that to organic farms. And so just an overview of what on-farm precision experimentation looks like. We start over here on the left side. You can see this is an example of a field. We start with a prescription map of an input across that field. And so we vary some input across the entire field. And what we're doing with organic farmers right now is varying seeding rates. And so we are varying seeding rates across the entire field to try to find some optimum seeding rate for each part of the field. And so once we've got our experiment in, we go and collect as much free data as we possibly can from that field. So that includes remote sensing information like NDVI and the topographical indices. We collect weather data. We get that as applied map off of the seeder. And then once the crop is up and harvestable, we get the yield monitor data off the combine. And one of the farmers that we're working with also has a protein monitor. Actually, a couple of the farmers do. And so we're able to analyze the protein as well. And then punching all that through an economic analysis, we come up with some kind of optimized net return map for the field. And from that, we come up with a prescription for the next year for that farmer. And so this is just an overview of what that OFP looks like. And then if I can just skip ahead here to one more slide, I'll show you guys. So this is where we have experiments set up. I'll point that out as well. We've got a few farmers up in the triangle, one down in Southeast Montana, and then my own farm back in Manitoba, where I'm from. And then I'm just going to skip through this stuff and just show you this slide here, just to show you a really quick example of what 1 year of this looked like. So here's an example of a 160 acre piece where we put in seeding rates, high, medium, and low. I can get the numbers for these exactly, but the point is that the medium rate is what the farmer would normally put in as an average rate across the entire field. And then we do something considerably higher than that and considerably lower. And normally we have more seeding rates than just 3, but this is a simplified example here of one that we did in the first year that we tried this. And then here's elevation map from that field. So we found elevation to be typically quite important as a predictor variable for how the crop is responding to these varied seeding rates. And then here's an example of an NDVI image from a previous crop, so that we start to get a sense of how the field responds yield-wise over time. And then here's the actual yield map from that year, and you can see that it's a pretty messy data set, but when we combine all these variables, we're able to come up with a optimized seeding map for that field. And so what you can see here in the bottom right corner is this is what if we knew what we know from this experiment, we would come up with this seeding map, which shows high seeding rates through most of the field, especially in the lower areas, and then in the higher areas we go to lower seeding rates. And so that's kind of an overview of what that looks like. And then the idea being the next year that we plant, this is wheat in this example on this field, we would put that optimized seeding rate in as our base layer. But because it was only 1 year in this case of experimental data, we would want to keep the experiment going. And so we include some varied rates within that field. And you can see that we keep experimental rates going across the field so that we can keep learning about the field. And so this is just one example of 1 year of wheat that we did, but we also have experiments going where we're varying pea green manures across fields and seeing how the cash crop after that responds to those varied rates of green manure. And we also have one farmer who's doing varied blood meal rates, an organic nitrogen source across their fields, to see how those work. So this is just this is just an overview, and there's more details in my presentation if you want to check it out. But yeah, happy to have a quick question period now if we have some time for that.
This is Jeff again. I'm an economist. So I'm really interested in the result and in being how much did that economically optimize to actually now. I mean, what are you showing in terms of economic gain from this precision?
Sure. Here, I'll just skip to that slide. These are the actual numbers from this field. So this, the red bottom left bar here is the experiment. So that's what the farmer actually made this year. If the farmer had applied the uniform rate like they normally would have, you can see it's about $15 a hectare here increase. And so that tells us that the experiment actually cost them some money because they were putting in those suboptimal seeding rates. But if we put in the optimized seeding rate for this, idealized year, we would predict that our profit goes up considerably, about $30 a hectare here. So, I mean, this is an ideal world that we're imagining the exact same conditions the following year, but over time, we think that we can start getting closer to this optimized number rather than this experimental number. This is just 1 year of data, but we have more data coming that'll be interesting to look at.
That's significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's imagining a perfect world, but it does suggest that there could be some impact. Mm-hmm.
I have
Are you
one more
familiar?
question.
No.
Go ahead. Just quickly, Tilly. Shut up.
No, go ahead, please.
Yesterday, again, we were looking at expense budgets of different farms in the Midwest, and it just became more and more clear that the labor associated with tillage and organic farms in the Midwest, corn, soybean things, was significantly different than non-organic farms. So, which was a big cost. And so, could something like this be? Could you do precision tillage type thing that would? Because it seems like that's one of the bigger costs that needs to.
Yeah, well, yeah. How are you imagining that tillage? I mean, that would be That would be
Well,
interesting.
I mean,
Types of
I
tillage?
don't know. I mean, maybe it doesn't work with the same degree with like wheat and things, but the point being that, and maybe that's the whole difference between Montana and the Midwest. It just seems that there's data showing that tillage and labor in tillage, the time in tillage, is a significant variable that is very different in terms of the expenses of running an organic farm. And I'm just wondering if that would play out. I don't know how you would do it with your model. I guess you would, vary the level of tillage. There's optimal tillage, I suppose, and there's less optimal tillage. And I don't know exactly how you would design that, but I'm just trying to.
Yeah, I
play
mean,
the-
it's reasonable.
The more expensive the input, the more you should want to optimize.
Right. Yeah, no, it's totally reasonable to think that, I mean, you could expand this method to any implement you're pulling across your field, anything that you're doing. I haven't seen anyone try that with tillage, but I'm probably someone's tried. We are working on something where we're trying to map weeds across the field so that we can imagine different ways of controlling those with more precision tools. Right now, just thinking about increasing seeding rates in weed patches, but we haven't tried anything with tillage. I don't know if anyone's worked on that.
Yeah, I would add to that optimization can be based on lots of different things. It gets pretty complex when you go beyond one factor, but optimization is always maximization or minimization of something. If it's weed control is one of the major factors, of course, in organic farming, and sometimes relates to the amount of tillage, going back to that question. But we could certainly, tillage could be considered as, if it's considered like a weed management treatment, perhaps, or some sort of field prep treatment. It could be considered as a factor that's being included in the net return function, I guess. And you always include the costs of doing whatever those operations are, so that it's the net outcome that you become interested in. So that's primarily how I can see it would be incorporated. But there are a few other things too that I think that we're experimenting with, that I've been experimenting with, at least with models, and that is stabilization of yields or of net returns over time, given the kind of variability that we have seen historically. And that can be pretty interesting, because that can start to influence what your inputs are in whether it's an organic or a conventional system. So those are just other thoughts about how we think about optimizing our operations, as being inclusive of the different factors that go into the system.
Are you familiar with the research being done by timeless agronomist Joseph Kibawat in collaboration with Central Ag Research Center? He's looking at lentils, seeding rates, different varieties, different rates of rhizobia, and also weed control. It seems like they're, it would be good to be in conversation with him. I think maybe things to learn, going both ways.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm not actually aware of his work, but I would definitely check that out. So far we haven't done anything with
Yeah,
lentils.
well, we'll get you connected with him for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know, Joseph, did you happen to be on this morning? Yeah, Joseph may be here. I'm just not aware. Yeah,
He was one of the ones
if not,
we were
we'll get you
trying to
connected.
get a presentation out of. He was in my 540, a graduate level class I had this fall. He had some really great information on seeding rates that he, in lentils, he did some nice stuff on yields. And then some other integrating techniques. Yeah, I think that would be a great thing. I was hoping he'd give a presentation for this.
Can I ask a few questions to Sasha?
Yeah, please, Oli.
One thing is first a comment regarding the tillage aspect of things.
Sure.
That thing is going to be very difficult. I would rather say time with tillage, it's more critical than anything else. You need to know exactly when you need to go and how you need to do it. That's more important than all this stuff here. But one of the questions I was going to ask you, Sasha, is how do you compute all this data? Do you have some kind of what do you call it, arithmetic or whatever? And how is that established to come out with your prescription, so to speak? Because there will be a lot of data that needs to be computed, so to speak. And how does that? Who has designed that? That's one question. The second question is, you guys had a presentation on Monday, and I couldn't be on the whole thing because of work on the farm. And on that presentation, on the conventional side, there was a lot of talk about protein. And no, protein is a huge one on wheat because it's how we're getting paid. But is there any way, in any form, we can start taking these things to a completely different level regarding looking at other nutritions? Because when you start looking at human health, we should principally start looking at maybe not completely protein, but looking at things like maybe iron, zinc levels in the wheat, other components that actually influences the health that varies across the field. So your prescriptions in an organic system can actually be completely different, because on the conventional side, we are looking at urea or nitrogen applications here. But on the organic side of things, we actually could start differentiating these things out across the field in a completely different manner to create a higher nutrition level in the food beyond protein.
Yeah, okay, that's a great set of questions. We could definitely spend the next hour talking about that. Basically, yeah, I'm kind of smiling here because you just labeled all the questions that we essentially talk about in our lab on a regular basis. So I'll just quickly hit all those questions, and then it's probably someone else's turn. But so I brought up a slide here, if you can see this, and this is just an example of what that data looks like that's coming off of the field. So you can see this is yield as a function of elevation and seeding rate. And you can see that's a pretty messy scatter of points. And so we do, this is like 100,000 data points that come off of that field that are coming off of the combine. And so it's a pretty messy data set, but we spend a while trying to find patterns in that. And you can see that we do with the computation that we're doing, with the modeling that we're doing, we do start to see patterns through that. So here you can see this blue line, this high seeding rate is typically doing better than the other seeding rates. And then when we get to the higher points, you see that flip. But yeah, we spend a lot of our time thinking about how to model these data and what that looks like. And we could spend a lot more time talking about that if you'd like sometime. And then just to touch on the other question you had, protein. So a couple of our farmers do have protein monitors, so we're looking at that. And we don't have any data off the green manure crops followed up with cash crops yet, but definitely stay tuned. Next year, we'll talk more about that. And then for the human health aspect, we'd be very interested in trying to see how some of these precision tools could potentially increase some of these human health metrics like zinc or iron, but we haven't done a ton of work on that yet. But theoretically, the protein monitor that some of the farmers have could be used to track some of those different elements. So that would be something interesting for the future as well. So those are really good ideas.
Thanks, Sasha, for the presentation and the responses. You guys can reach out to Sasha if you have more questions. So I guess we'll move on. And the next person on my list, the next student presenter on my top Zoom screen bar is Sarah Eiden. Sarah wants to step up and introduce herself and present to us about her work.
Yeah, thank you. I know my presentation had some technical issues with sound, so I don't think it actually, the presentation's up there, but I don't think it was, you can really listen to it. So if I can go ahead and share my screen real quick. Are you guys seeing the presentation? I have a few slides.
Yep.
Okay. So my work is kind of on a different lens than I think most of the student presentations here. It's less focused on agronomy and growing techniques or methods, and more looking towards community food forests as a piece of a larger community food production system. I'm looking at it through a social ecological perspective. I'm doing a qualitative ecosystem service assessment of the ecosystem services provided by community food forests. And community food forests have a long history in agroecology, agroforestry, and permaculture. So they're really relying on these natural organic solutions for food production and intentionally putting in structural and functional heterogeneity to mimic natural ecological functions of a climate appropriate forest for food production. But they're not just forest systems, they are community systems. So community food forests are multi-story perennial food-based systems that are designed intentionally to mimic the natural structures and functions of the ecology of a place in the form of a public commons. They provide a place where people can collaboratively grow food. So as communities are gathering and collaborating in this form of a public commons, the commons become places of human and human ecological interactions and connections. So community food forests are defined and shaped and adapted by the community and the ecology of the place and the climate of the place that they're representing and that in which they're established. And so my work is looking at, I'm using, there's a community food forest in Helena, Montana, that's my, acting as a case study for how users are perceiving it, how they're using the community food forest and how they're perceiving its benefits. And I'm also looking at kind of compiling a list of known community food forests in the United States, looking at their mission and vision statements and asking what are they intending to provide for, how are they being established, and how are they, and what are the services they're providing. So my presentation that didn't get recorded, I kind of went through each of these. I'm using the ecosystem service typology set forth by the United Nations as one of the lenses in which I'm looking at the utility of these systems. And in my presentation, kind of the intent was to go through kind of each of these and show how are they meant to provide for the provisionary aspects of the tangible benefits, the cultural services or the intangible regulating and supporting services or more of the ecosystem health benefits. But just for sake of time, I'm just going to quickly recap some general trends that I'm seeing. And my research right now is very preliminary, just sent out a survey. I'm in the process of beginning some interviews. But what I'm finding is that while every community food forest is meant to provide food as kind of its essence, the food reference and intentions of the mission statements of community food forests in the United States, as well as some initial findings from Sixth Ward Garden Park, these intentions reflect deeper goals of food security or food equity and food accessibility as opposed to just food provision. And that's by nature reflected in the design of the systems and the free pick structure of a community food forest. So these are systems that are making kind of secondary unproductive landscapes productive for fresh and healthy food access. But so while those are prevalent in every system, the cultural services seem to be what is most valued and most referenced in the goals and missions of community food forests. So these would be the cultural heritage, environmental education, inspiration, recreation, sense of place, social connection, and spiritual or religious values. Those are more heavily referenced in the vision and mission statements, and at this point, more valued by the community users in Sixth Ward Garden Park. And when looking at those in particular, environmental education, social connection are kind of the most valued services provided by community food forests. And so while community food forests are never intended to replace other forms of food production within a community, kind of what we're seeing initially is that they are offering additional services such as these cultural benefits, as well as restoration benefits that are unique towards community food forests. And so these are meant to be kind of advocating for these to be pieces in a larger community-based food production system. So that was definitely brief, and that was kind of a quick overview of a lot of the information that I intended to cover, but I will take any questions you guys might have. I recognize that this is slightly different than the threads of some of the other student presentations.
Yeah, this is Jeff Chizinski again. The economist will bug you, but I note that there's no sense of intention, it even seems, to make these things economically viable in a sense. The values seem to be beyond. And is there, I mean, are these usually the public sector providing, or gifts, or, you know, the land itself? I mean, there's labor going in, there's, you know, effort going in, there's value coming out, but it doesn't seem like whether or not it has some kind of net economic benefit or not is even calculated, it seems.
Yeah, so I've this past semester spent some time doing a scoping review of how these systems are being studied in the literature, and it's really limited, the studies that have been done, and kind of to your point, there hasn't been really any significant studies addressing the economic aspect. There was one publication that was kind of looking at the economic input and the output, but as a food forest, that's obviously going to change over time as the system matures and develops. So there is some information and some studies looking at the high, to your point, there is a high initial cost in labor and building and all the inputs that go into the system, and each system is very different in terms of how that is accounted for. So some of these are through grants, some of these are city donations, some of them in Helena, Montana. The piece of land was gifted by the city as part of the Park Service and the Parks and Recreations Department. So there's virtually zero cost to be on the land, and there's zero maintenance costs. It's covered by the Parks and Recreation in Helena, but everyone's different, and so it's kind of hard there hasn't been great assessment of the economic benefits, because as you again mentioned, they're not these highly productive systems, so they're not necessarily decreasing grocery bills. There's a lot of components. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question more towards saying there's a lot of components that haven't been thoroughly studied, because it isn't what we're seeing is it's not the main purpose of the system, and each system is very different. So a lot of these are user supported, community supported projects.
I have a similar question, or I guess maybe a comment about that. This is Bruce. It seems like this is a perfect place to do to capture that concept of those services that are in the realm of spirituality or just valued generally for their aspects beyond the food production, is a willingness to pay. And I recall a study that I think was done by Rob King at the University of Minnesota, where there was a piece of land that, as part of the experiment station at the University of Minnesota, it was right adjacent to the campus, but the city grew up around it. So it had been there for a long time, and it was like a quarter of a section. But the value of that land to the neighbors was tremendous. And in fact, to the degree that they were willing to pay and tax themselves quite highly to make up for lost tax revenues, for example. So I think that's a way to get at that kind of question, perhaps, is to look at those kinds of studies as supportive evidence for the fact that neighbors to those places are going to place quite high value, I think, on those pieces. and maybe it goes beyond that even. As you said, I mean, if the community is willing to pay for it through, maintaining it, et cetera, through the Parks and Rec or whatever, that's an indication in itself. But it seems like you could actually get to the specifics of neighborhoods of interest or maintaining those pieces. So anyway, neat work. Good job.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's one of the things that we're hoping to find from some of this data collecting, the intangible externalized values of these systems to neighborhoods and communities.
Hey, Sarah, this is Ole here. I was kind of wondering how does it work in a garden like that? I mean, the homesteaders kind of came out here and put their stake down. This is my land. So how does it work in a garden like this? Does anybody just walk in and say, okay, I'm gonna have this little piece here for the next 6 months, or is there some kind of a board or overseer? How's this structured?
Yeah, it's a good question. Mostly because it's very hard to answer because everyone is very different. So for example, the one in Helena is it is freely accessible. It is it's maintained by some volunteers in the community, but the maintenance the intent is that a maintenance of a food forest will only decrease over time as it begins to self-maintain and self-renew. But it is open to whoever wants to come in and pick and harvest. But there's also your standard community gardens in association with it, so where you would rent a plot and you would grow your own annual vegetables, for example. Some other places it looks more different than that. In Philadelphia, there's a huge network of community food forests, and their intent is saying that community gardens require an upfront level of input. You have to have the finances to rent your plot, some base knowledge on how to grow your vegetables, some seed, and so they're exclusionary in that aspect. So food forests have been developed across the city as neighborhood projects where anyone can come in and harvest, but they are maintained and grown by the neighborhood in which they reside in. So your question, I think, is a really good question, and I think that's part of the reason why maybe they're not as prevalent across the states, because this idea of a public commons is so contradictory to private land ownership that is, I think, defined the way that we've established as communities.
I wonder if there must be millions. I can imagine. Maybe I'm wrong, but I could imagine that you might have some very interesting stories of conflict too, though, that result from such things, because you could just, some guy that's visiting Philadelphia just goes there and grabs all the apples or whatever, and runs away, and then people are pissed because they do that and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a major question, and I think a barrier in a lot of these projects being implemented. But I have yet to find, granted, I will say that I'm using Helena as a case study, and so the information I'm getting from sources, the other community food forests in the US, they're not kind of in-depth interviews or anything like that. But there haven't been any actual references that concern has been something that these community food forests have actually had to deal with or struggle with. What I'm seeing as my initial data from Sixth Ward Garden Park is that people tend to be really hesitant to actually harvest. So these systems that they're saying, come harvest, pick, we actually need you to pick these fruits and vegetables, are actually not being as utilized as they hope to be. I think because of again, maybe it's our cultural tendency that we view land as private, therefore this fruit is not mine, it's not for my picking. So it's interesting because I think that's a really valid concern, but one that we're seeing is not actually playing out as we thought, as we expected it would.
I have one question for you, Sarah. This is Hannah. In your pie chart of different services you saw, how do you think that would look if you gave your same survey to maybe an organic producer at this conference? Do you think we place as much cultural value on other forms of ag?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I'm out of the University of Montana, and we have a farm associated with our environmental studies department who did a kind of a similar project on this student kind of interned farm. And some of the stuff that they found was that this cultural services, I think the more hands-on the community is in this food production, the more we're seeing these cultural services increase. And so if it's, for example, like a farm that's operating on a CSA where CSA members are partaking, then I would expect that we might see this increase. If it's a kind of large-scale organic farm that's kind of selling to the community, and that's less reliant on hands-on, I would hypothesize that maybe these cultural services would be less important. So it seems to me, based on some of these vision mission statements and data from the park here, as well as our farm associated with the university, the more involved the community is to this piece of land, to tangibly getting their hands in the dirt and around this piece of land, the more the cultural services increase as important.
Thank you.
But that's go ahead.
Sarah, I have a question. Have you come across the work of Elaine Ostrom, the economist you have?
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah, you're much of she won the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, for economy about dealing with common pool resources. And her principles, I think, would dovetail quite nicely and to help you get, and to answer Jeff's question, what is the overall value to the community?
Yeah, thank you.
That's very interesting. I actually got to meet Eleanor Ostrom and presented a paper on at a conference, and the conference was amazing. This is a long time ago, before she ran the prize, but it is interesting because they study these situations in, for example, in California, there's public lands, and people use public lands for harvesting mushrooms and all kinds of different things. And there's like Wiccan covens that are fighting with each other. I mean, there was a lot of conflict. And her point of Eleanor Ostrom was to create, there's this idea that people can govern commons. And they do. For instance, Switzerland has maintained common grazing for 500 years, amongst themselves with rules and governing systems, that had to be set up over time. It is a very fascinating, and she's actually, her work is amazing and not really well known by a lot of economists.
Yeah, this is Becky. I have a comment, or I don't know whether to call it a comment or question or what it is, but although I agree with Bruce that using willingness to pay as a metric for how people value this makes a lot of sense, but it also potentially leads you in some dangerous territory of not necessarily listening to all the voices you want to listen to. And I can't help but look at this with a little bit of a retrospective eye. And I don't know how much literature there is on this, but I think it would be hard to overestimate the sort of educational / recreational / something value for kids. And they may not express this in the way that is easy to measure, but I look back on my childhood as mostly a suburban kid, and the places where there were wild edges, parks where you could do stuff, parks where you could grow stuff or see wild stuff growing. It's really hard to pick those things apart, but it's infinite value as far as I'm concerned in what it means for people growing up in such a place. And it also relates back to your discussion of whether a commons is feasible. I mean, I grew up largely in New England, which is nothing but a story of how people learn to either manage or mismanage the commons. Back in high school, I did a term paper. I went back and read town meeting records, originally in handwriting, and much of the discussion was about the tragedy of the commons and the value of the commons. it's a vocabulary that was once very rich in this country and around the world, and we have lost it in some places, but not everywhere. And so I'm a little bit worried that in our zeal to monetize and everything, that we drop some of the most important variables. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I just think it's a caution to have. Whether you're worrying about farming or food supply or the history of wilderness and land protection, these community forests, in my view, potentially have value that is very hard to quantify.
I appreciate that point. And just for just a note of encouragement, a lot of the studies that have been done so far regarding community food forests are in the realm of education and development, childhood development, and its role in and human health and well-being, which is pretty encouraging that they're getting a place in that discussion.
I'm going to jump in here with a comment about the Moon Randolph Homestead, which is a unique city-owned property that Missoula has that includes an orchard and a small garden. And it's a subsistence farm and quite rustic. But I am involved with some preservation efforts in Missoula. And one of the things we're doing is to try to preserve a building, the Lalonde Ranch, that was once a very successful farm. And part of the justification is to contrast the subsistence farm with a more economically successful farm, let's put it that way. And their distance is very short, actually. So I guess I see this as, influencing city planning as well.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
I'd like to ask Jim Barngrover, since he's a resident of Helena and a food activist and active in the community garden projects there for decades, probably. Jim, do you have any comments on especially the social aspect and the educational aspect as from someone who's actually involved in those projects, as far as the contributions they make and the focus that those projects might have or might want to improve upon?
Well, you caught me distracted, David. I've been working on another presentation.
Okay.
But in terms of my familiarity and work with Sixth Ward Garden Park in Helena, it has coalesced all kinds of different stakeholders, from group homes of young teenagers that have, maybe gone awry or had difficulties at home, to young unwedded mothers, to school service clubs, and a myriad of other stakeholders. And a lot of educational activities have happened there. And it is a nucleus and real asset of that community, which in that area, which had really been in decay and now is really becoming revitalized and many different ways with new businesses. And it's just, it's a place that's really improved the physical, the cultural value of the community.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Well, I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for letting me share this line of work. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a great presentation, good discussion. Yeah, we're happy you're here. So I think the next person on my screen would be Hannah Duff, and she's going to present some of her research work.
Awesome. Let's see. I'll share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yeah, looks good, Hannah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to tell you briefly about my first year results looking at these ecological refugia in basically on one organic farm, on the Bailey farm. And so basically the idea of my research here is, for example, this is a refugia that Oli has on his farm, but it's looking at patches of land that can be taken out of production because either they're hard to plant, they're not fertile, or a farmer just wants to increase biodiversity on their farm, and taking them out of production and then seeing if not only can you save time and money by not planting them, but if there's some sort of additional benefit, maybe an ecosystem service like Sarah was talking about. And so, like I mentioned, we started with this one up near Fort Benton, and last summer I collected data on the plant, insect, and the small mammal diversity in the field and in the refugia. And so basically the hope is that these little patches, even though they're really small, they can actually harbor some sort of biodiversity within the field. And then, like I mentioned, that as you move away from them, if they are beneficial, you'll see some sort of difference. So maybe you'll see a decline in native plants and animals, and maybe you'll also see some sort of difference in how the crops perform. And so, like I mentioned, we started with sampling plant diversity. We used a sweep net to collect insect samples, and then we set out these live traps to collect small mammals. And so here's some preliminary maps I've made. This one shows how species richness, which is however many types of plants we found in each of these frames. And you can see these red colors are much higher species richness. And this map just kind of fills in all the gaps and shows you that we would expect to see really high species richness in the refuge and not so much in the crop field, which is kind of a given, right? But that's a good sign this refuge is actually hosting some sort of plant diversity. And so we would expect that, as you're moving away from the refuge, you have a decrease in plant species richness, and perhaps there's some sort of decrease in beneficial ecosystem services too. And we're working on ways to measure those better. And one way we can do that is we broke it down between native plants and non-native plants. And so this was just a cool day out in the field. I noticed in the refuge, this winter fat shrub, it always has butterflies on it. And then you have other sort of pollinators that are just really drawn to these flowering plants. Whereas we also, of course, find non-native species in the refuge, and these could become problematic. And so we wanted to know, where are these distributed? And so this is just of native plant species richness. And once again, you can see these darker colors. It's a lot higher in the refuge. And so that's a good sign that we have a lot of native species concentrated here, and they're obviously not causing problems in the crop field. And for non-native species, you can see they're a lot higher actually in the field and not so much in the refuge. And so that's kind of a good sign that the refuge doesn't seem to be a source of weeds. And so that's kind of maybe a possible way to start looking at other benefits regarding the insect community. And so this is where I've started identifying all the insects we found on the Bailey farm. And basically what we found that's similar to the plant species richness, as we're moving away from the refuge, we have a lot less types of insects. And so what I really want to do next is group some of these insects here into functional groups. For example, I noticed like more of the pollinator species, I always find them in the refuge, and then a lot of grasshoppers tend to be in the field. And so I'll work on grouping those to get a better idea. And then just lastly, I'll kind of go through this quickly. We looked at seed predation because our mammal traps didn't work out so well. So basically I just left these popsicle sticks out in the field for 2 weeks, and they had these 4 different seed types. And I just looked at where they were eaten. And so you can see wherever the purple is where crop seeds were eaten. And so we saw that the crop seed predation was pretty high in the refuge and not as high in the field. And I'm not sure if that means like they could still be eating crop seeds out here, right? Because they're just so abundant. So that's an interesting result I have to look into a little bit more. And the same with weed seed predation was really low. We only had 1 weed seed eaten. And once again, we're not sure if that's because there is a lot of weed seeds just already available, so they didn't need to take them from the traps. So I'll keep working on trying to measure weed seed predation and crop seed predation and trying to see if having more small mammals is a beneficial service or not in the field. And so, yeah, I'm going to continue doing the same exact methods on 2 other farms, one other organic farm and then one conventional, and eventually just mapping the crop yield data around the refuge to see what that looks like. So thank you all. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, we can do that.
This is Jeff again. I'll start. Are you familiar with the Crabtree's farm and their pollinator strips? I would think, I mean, that isn't quite this full-blown ecological refuge that you seem to be studying here, but they're kind of like that, and they do that very intentionally, you know, in broad strips, and have dedicated pretty high percentage of their working lands to those. And I know it's obviously beneficial for pollinators, but I think they have at least anecdotal evidence suggesting that there's benefits for the active part of farming too. Have you run across those guys at all?
Yeah, well, so I haven't been to the Crabtree farm, but I've heard about the prairie strip work at Iowa State, and that's been really encouraging to me because I know Oli and I have talked about it. Just the results they're showing at conferences, yeah, show even if you only plant, 3 species in a strip, you're going to get a lot more benefits. So I think this work is very linked to that, and they could definitely be, partnered in the future.
This is Becky. In a sense, you could call this a community forest for small creatures. I'm wondering if you're familiar with some of the literature that the Wild Farm Alliance has compiled, because there's been a whole lot of interest in hedgerows and other forms of wild edges. And the husband of Joanne, who's kind of the executive director of Wild Farm Alliance, has done a ton of work on hedgerows in California. And I think there's been quite a bit of study of benefits in terms of pollinators and birds and all kinds of relationships to what's happening in the cropping field. Mm-hmm. And of course, it won't be exactly analogous to a Montana wheat field, but I think the basic concept that you're talking about is not only is it an important study of the intrinsic value of these existing small patches, but I think it might even encourage the development of more such wild edges without really detracting from the wheat farmers' overall value. So it's a really cool study, and I think it merits more attention. I hope farmers pay attention.
Thanks for that, Rec. I haven't heard of that, so I'll look into that.
Yeah, I can try to put you in touch with some people, because there's all sorts of interesting literature. A lot of it is Joanne, really, her background is as an ornithologist, and that's sort of what led her into working in agriculture to some degree. And there's a lot of different people studying this, but not so much in the Great Plains. Also, you probably have already looked at Xerxes Society. There's some of their pollinator research is related to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I had a species list from this exact refuge actually that they had done one inventory, and then they didn't come back, but it was helpful to see that.
Just a plug for NCAT ACHA, Rex Ford. Becky works with Joanne. I know Joanne quite well, and that's actually another whole thing. The birds are really important. I mean, just think of what they're eating, a lot of insects and bats, bat conservatory. So yeah, and it does seem the Californians have a head start on this in terms of their agricultural systems compared to our neck of the woods.
Hannah, excuse me, Hannah, I can't remember the source, but I've read some stuff recently, and this has taken these comments on hedgerows, pollinator strips, even the small refugia. There is some recent research that says that the landscape diversity needs to be more widespread, and that pollinator strips specifically are not as effective as, say, multiple crop rotations in the same vicinity, same area. It gets into this landscape fragmentation concepts of landscape ecology. I encourage you to, maybe not in this study, but to think in terms in a broader landscape terms and in the future in terms of describing what needs to be done on the landscape. There's a global movement right now that says in order for us to stabilize natural systems, we need all these developed farm fields to dedicate about 20 to 30% of their land base to this type of thing, which is more significant than these small refuges you're dealing with. And it's proving out from their studies that it's actually beneficial economically, yield-wise and such, for them to do that. And so the critical thing on the large scale is having enough habitat dispersed across the landscape to preserve this diversity. And if we get too focused on hedgerows and strips and tiny little refugias, it's going to be a lot less bang for our buck, is my opinion at this point.
That's a good point. I've been struggling with this issue of scale too, because like I should always mention, this is not a substitute for preserving like larger areas, and just thinking, are these patches enough to connect a larger source population to another? And like you said, it's definitely not enough to just focus on these. That's a great point.
Yes, Steve, I totally agree with you. I see this more as an opportunity to demonstrate to farmers that, look, you've got some lurking potential here. Let's expand upon it. There are also people who've been working with states and federal people to encourage better use of highway median strips and all sorts of quote unquote unproductive edges and enhance them for use of the sort that you're talking about. And there's also examples in California of vegetable producers who have already decided it's worth their while to dedicate significant portion of their farm to more wild uses. And they're like in the wineries, they're doing beneficial insect patches that aren't so small. There's a broccoli guy who has, for every 2 rows of his brassicas, he's got a row of alyssum and other flowers, which basically eliminate his need for insecticides. This is a guy who's growing 1,200 acres of broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage. So I really feel like, yeah, Steve is probably right. This stuff is too small, but it's a really great educational tool for experimenting and demonstrating the value of wild parts.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Becky, and it's great research, Hannah, and keep doing it. In the on the marketplace side, there is increasing acceptance and visibility for going beyond organic, if you will, with regenerative organic certification. Rodale Research Center and Patagonia and some other organically focused companies are absolutely promoting this, and we're seeing it increasingly come from some of our customers to a timeless. And I think these tools and these demonstration projects and your type of research is going to be very important for keeping farmers kind of on the cutting edge of where the organic market is actually appearing to go, and no doubt will go in the coming in the coming decade or so. And it's going to have not only to do with soil health, but also to biodiversity, wild areas on the farms and so forth. So keep doing what you're doing for sure.
I don't need to point this out, David, but we know, and Joanne Baumgartner led this, that the standards themselves require biodiversity in organic farming. We may not do enough of that, but it's there, and it's a very important point that she worked very hard, Joanne did, to get that in and more noticed in the program. So I think organic should pat itself on the back as being one who has recognized that early on and has taken it to heart.
Yeah, it's definitely getting traction in the marketplace. So it's good.
This is pretty dang cool what Hannah is doing here, and she's actually doing it on my farm too. And I just want to comment on the spots she's on my farm is, and this farm has been sprayed with chemicals for probably 30 years or God knows how long, and I started converting it when I got here. So this spot here that Hannah showed has actually been sprayed down with Roundup. because they could run the sprayer through it all the time, but they never got anything out of it. So I just start going around it instead, and it just came out naturally, like the way it is right now, as the picture shows. So actually having Hannah following that specific spot is actually very interesting from the aspect of a conventional standpoint of view. What actually happens to the wildlife, and what actually also potentially happens to the plant diversity in these things here. I'm fully aware that that some of these spots can be overgrown by cheatgrass. This is not in any way, any form. And so there might be something one in a conventional aspect of things have to consider planting into it to avoid the cheatgrass aspect of things. So it's actually very interesting to see what's going to happen to this spot here with both the insects and these different things in this spot here, as well as the plan is on this field here. It's a 220-acre field. That was usually one big field. It's going to be divided up into 6 or 7 different fields with pollinator strips in between in the coming years to see what effects does that have on the whole equation and as well as this spot here. So what Hannah is doing is pretty dang cool. So I just want to make that comment.
Thanks, Ole. This is Bruce, and I think that Hannah's work has been very interesting, and there was so many issues and things to consider up front as we had many discussions about the scaling issue in particular. But I just want to point out that by intensively studying these smaller areas, we're hoping that we can start to see some of the processes that will be present, and then we can scale from there and learn about the scale issue as we might go up. But we kind of taking these minimal sized patches as our first step, and agreed there's something to size that's going to have an impact, but we're thinking that even getting a small benefit in a small range from these things will be detectable and doable within the context of a student doing their kind of work over a 3 or 4 year period. So that those were constraints that we considered, and it's not that we're ignoring those I guess those scaling issues, but thought we would take this approach as a starting point. So anyway, your comments are all right on, and really appreciate them. And Hannah's done a great job of trying to negotiate all these factors.
Yeah, that concept of starting with small study areas makes a lot of sense. And we just all hope that this will grow. But I'm assuming, Bruce and Hannah, that you guys have been having conversations with Laura Burkle and the pollinator folks at MSU about this, or have you maybe had a chance to do that or planning to do that?
Another good point. I've talked with her probably twice, but I should send her some more updates and see what she thinks about this scale issue for sure.
Well, it would be interesting because I know nationally, this is really part of a broader discussion of what we are doing to our national landscape by virtue of how the Farm Bill is structured. And I think that many people just simply don't understand the consequences of our fence row to fence row mindset that has dominated our national policy for a few decades, several decades. And having some concrete data from very small patches and other size patches could really help contribute to a saner discussion as we do things like try to figure out who the hell the Secretary of Agriculture is going to be. I mean, it's all true. It's only one part of a broader discussion, but in fact, I think it should be a growing part of that broader discussion. And I think David Owen is right that there's increasing popular support for taking it that seriously.
Yeah, I will say that just on Monday we had our Precision Ag Research Association meeting, which is primarily conventional growers and crop consultants. And I was amazed at how much interest there was in Hannah's study. She had lots of great questions and really pretty high interest from even conventional folks. So they're curious and they really want to see what this comes out to be. I wouldn't have predicted that, but I think that there's significant interest.
Yeah, folks, I feel I need to clarify. I wasn't trying to downplay the importance of the small refugia studies when I made the comments about the larger scale needs and such and the larger picture. My farm is way smaller than Ole's, and a patch like that on my farm is you know, it's really significant. And I found just as a farmer and observing the changes on areas that I handle differently is an important lesson that I learn every year. And I don't do the data, robust data collection that Hannah's doing, so I don't really have as good information. You know, concerns about like thistle or cheatgrass taking over those areas. It's interesting because areas that I've let go, sometimes they stabilize themselves without any weed control. And I think this is all really good stuff. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Hannah. That was very stimulating. To plug another student in our department, in the LRES department, Laisa is actually, she came to me and we made a species list of a non-tilled exclosure at the Northern Ag Research Station where she came away with like 100 species, but she was looking for extra floral nectaries on those species, because those extra floral nectaries actually feed the predator of the wheat stem sawfly. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to and services provided by these. Dan Chichinsky was the last student in our last few minutes that we have, but he was unable to make it today. But he's been working with me on the disease ecology of Puccinia punctiformis thistle rust, and how it systematically infects Canada thistle and has the potential to be integrated into a integrated weed management system to reduce Canada thistle in some of our fields. So he's been an undergraduate in the lab for about 1.5 years and is now transitioning into being a graduate student. He just graduated this December. And he has a couple of projects that he's going to be looking at. And he has one project at Fort Ellis where we have infected and non-infected thistle, and he's incorporating a mowing and tillage regime in there and measuring root biomass and how the Puccinia affects the plots. He's been doing some greenhouse work that he presented in his great presentation on the relative competitiveness of Canada thistle when it's systematically infected with the fungus. And he does see that Canada thistle, you can lower its relative competitiveness when it is systematically infected. And he's got about 40% infection rates in a couple of his replications. So it's promising. He's working on developing good protocol techniques, looking at climate conditions, when to really go out and do that, and improving the inoculation techniques. And then we're monitoring across a range of environments, a number of patches in combination with Jed Eberly, myself, and Melissa Maggio at Montana Biocontrol to understand where the Puccinia could be most effective. And so we've inoculated lots of patches across the state. We're monitoring those. One of my hypotheses is that, and it's something Dave Sands alluded to a little bit the other day, is if you're an obligate pathogen to a host, it's not ideal to drive your host to extinction. So one of the things we're thinking about is what's the size of patches, where it occurs, and where could it be most effective? And I've been thinking a lot about the hypothesis of it may be most effective on the smallest, youngest patches in terms of really weakening them and driving them down. I think that's a summary of some of his presentation and his work that we've been thinking about. He's the person him and Jed Eberly are the person to ask the biology questions to. It's a very complicated thistle rust, has 6 spore stages in it, so it's hard to use. We've known about it for a long time, but we've not really been able to implement it in any sort of cropping system. So that's what Dan is going to be working on his master's, and he's out at OLA's number of the on-farm sites and measuring and detecting sort of change in Canada thistle. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take a few questions from you.
This is Ole here. I do have a couple of questions, Tim. because I went across my pasture in September, and to my surprise, I actually was able to collect rust from probably 20 different or 30 different plants that actually showed rust across the pasture, and especially up to the edges of the field. They were. And they were only single plants in a spot, maybe 2 or 3 plants in a spot. That's all I saw. And if I could recollect what Dan was talking about, is that each seed that comes from a Canadian thistle and starts, that is one root system. So he basically pointed out that in a big spot of Canadian thistles, you can actually have X amount of different root systems completely entwined, but actually completely separate. And if I understand correct, the rust doesn't jump across the root system, even though they are very, very close. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's it becomes systematic in that one single individual, but that individual may go in all kinds of different directions and be sort of intertwined with other individuals. It would have to be infected through the above ground biomass later, but is not transmitted through the root rhizome.
So follow-up question. I collected all these different things, and they've been lying in my garage for drying out, and I didn't have time because I was closing down a farm, moving equipment this fall, to do any of the preparations. So is there a way, and I kind of elaborate a little bit on the other day on the MSU call, and I was asking if it could be used in the spring, and it was kind of, the answer was kind of no, but can I preserve these things I have lying in the grass as all dried down, or has the spores already opened up and it's floating around in my garage, so to speak?
I think you should be able to preserve them. And I think you just kind of need to grind it into a powder and then maybe leave it in a breathable paper bag, like a brown lunch bag, and leave it in a cool place where you don't have a lot of temperature change, somewhere around below room temperature at some cool area. And I think you can preserve it. I don't know how fast it sort of decays, and it won't work, but or won't be able to infect it. But you can preserve it for a fairly good amount of time. And then an early fall application is kind of one of the most beneficial times to really get that infection going. That makes sense in that context, Ola?
Yes, it does. I will see if I can get my timing better in the following years here, because I can see this as a viable thing to get it out of the pastures and the drawers and all this stuff here, if I can actually figure out how to do this. In the field, it's a little more complicated because we till and we provoke things, and to see the effects in the fields, it's going to be interesting to see what Dan is going to do and how he's going to approach that, and also how efficient we actually can spread these spores here in helping the disease move across farm, so to speak. That's going to be very interesting to follow, because I think this is a very, very viable route to go if we know all the details and how to work this. Thanks.
Yeah, it won't be a silver bullet, but I think it'll be something that'll help reduce its competitive ability. And I think you're right when you're talking about perennial pastures. I think it'll be helpful.
Can I go back to a question for Sasha, or are there other things about this first?
If no one has any questions, you feel free to ask Sasha a question. I think we were supposed to end at 10:30, but if no one minds, we can hang around a little longer.
Well, I'll just plant the seed. We can have more discussion later, but somebody was asking at the end about looking at other micronutrients like iron and zinc and so forth as part of the data collection. And in theory, that makes all kinds of sense. I'm having trouble imagining what that looks like, because it seems like many of the micronutrients would be a function of either seed genetics, soil, microbial life, or in some cases, variation in soil type. And I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about how you would, not just the actual measurement of the micronutrient, but how you would try to work with it in a precision ag context. And that's kind of a complicated question, so you may not even want to try to discuss it right now, but it's something to think about. Bruce and I have had an interesting discussion after Organic U about how is it that we've meaningfully integrate some of these quantitative precision ag studies with the actual problem solving that farmers and food providers really need to do. And that's sort of an existential question for agriculture education in general. So I don't expect any easy answers.
Sasha, do you want to take a shot? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, yeah, no, I mean, that, like you say, that's a very big question. I think from a research standpoint, where we're at right now, we're a ways away from actually explaining that variability and telling or coming up with recommendations for how to control for those elements like zinc or iron, for example. But we would start with trying to figure out if we could actually map that across the field. I think that's the point where we are realistically at. Can you actually find areas on your field where you're producing more nutritious food? And then we would start learning about, okay, how could we start controlling that within an organic system? But yeah, we could definitely talk about that more, I think.
We actually have done a little bit of that as preliminary work. This was a few years back when we were first perfecting the use of our protein analyzer that's on the go, that's on the combine. And what we had a series of wheat varieties that were known to have different levels of iron. And with that particular element, what we were looking at is how the absorbance spectrum was changing with those different varieties, so that would relate hopefully to iron. So if we can come up with that, so for example, we get 38 bands of spectral absorbance from the machine, from the protein analyzer. Protein analyzer actually only ends up using about 3 of those bands, but the output from the machine is available to us, so we get all 38. So if we can pick up the spectral signature of those different iron levels, we could actually start to relate that back to some of the iron-based qualities that we might want to market on, or and be able to determine what factors are affecting those across the field. So some of these modern techniques of monitoring what's actually in the field could be used in a very strategic way, I think, to understand exactly what we're producing and really start to put a much stronger focus on the qualities that we're producing.
Thanks.
This is Ole here. I just want to comment to Bruce here and ask, in respect of these spectrums you're getting off the monitor, have you thought about using the food lab at the university to analyze those spectrums? I mean, Helena has a tremendous amount of machinery or instruments that can analyze everything from God knows to God knows what. And would there be a correlation or some kind of correspondence between using her lab and your spectrums reading out of a field to quantify what you just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. And Selena and I have talked about this before, and it's we just don't have anybody that has stepped up, and it's just one of those. I don't know how low hanging that fruit is. I think it's actually quite high on the tree, but nonetheless, if somebody walked up and said they wanted to do that, we probably would embrace them. But yeah, it just takes somebody committed to it, probably a PhD student that would take something like that on, or it would take us writing yet another grant to do this stuff. But yes, I think the option and the possibilities are there. I think we're actually fairly well equipped at MSU to do some of this. it kind of goes back to some of the things that Bob Quinn and I have talked about a lot, is that if we could get some markers on inflammatory mechanisms, and there's so much more now known, and that the rate at which we're developing an understanding of those factors is amazing. So all of these things are where we start to merge agriculture with human health qualities are just blossoming. So many great possibilities out there. I guess I'll say one other thing about that, though. It is interesting how agronomists just can't imagine this. We're so siloed in what we do that there's very few people out there that are that are thinking about these mergings, especially from the agronomic side. It's all people that think about food quality and those aspects, nutritional people coming out of nutrition programs that are basically raising these questions.
So why is that? Why is that?
Because we're siloed. I mean, we have one building on one end of campus that does nutrition, and a building on the other end of campus that does agriculture, and the two haven't got together much. I think actually we probably do it as well as anybody. When I say we, MSU or Montana in general, because we're small enough to where it is easy to interact and we go look for those people. But it just amazes me that these things haven't been further developed in other places.
I would argue that it isn't only because you're siloed. I think it has something to do with the fact that the farm bill and all the incentives have driven farmers and agronomists both to be laser focused on one or two variables to all of our detriment.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at the USDA grant programs, there's nothing, I mean, you wouldn't know where to apply to do this kind of work. That's interesting in itself.
So I just want to follow up in respect to this, because OAC is actually working on creating some kind of a template for what we just talked about. It's still in the works, but somewhere down the line, we'll probably see if we can gather some people, including you, Bruce, and some further discussion on some of these issues and how to take that to the next level. So it's something we've been working on for a couple of years now on the side.
Well, this was a great session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for your work and for sharing your generous sharing of it. And I look for good things in the future.
Exactly. Here's
Thank
to
you, Jamie.
2021.
2021, yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you.
Everyone,
Thank
bye.
you.